Good morning, everyone. I'm glad you could join me in discussing the full extent of the shadow government and the deep state. As many of you have seen my 3-hour lecture on the shadow government and the deep state, I think we've got just about a million, 1,200,000 views or so on that. But what I want to do in these programs is break that 3-hour lecture speech down to about 20-minute segments so that you can view each segment at a time as you would like. So I'm coming to you from the confidential studios of Ascent Publishing, located somewhere deep in the southern United States. Be difficult to find the studio, and that's on purpose. I'm going to be talking about cutting-edge things regarding current government violations of the Constitution, the times the government does things right regarding the Constitution. I will be exposing the shadow government. I taught federal conspiracy law at a university, and this is not conspiracy theory stuff. This stuff is legitimate, it's actual, and it's documented, and you'll see that in the slides that I'll be presenting. So this is the first of our broadcasts, so welcome everyone. I hope you enjoy it. You can go to my website, fortheloveoffreedom.net. That's fortheloveoffreedom.net, and you can see all the evidence documents on there regarding my background and my expose against the CIA and some of their abuses of secrecy. As they say, it's a dirty job, but somebody's got to do it. So let's start today by getting into just the high-level aspect of the shadow government and exactly what the shadow government is made up of. It's a relatively complex topic. And what I center in on, because I witnessed this personally, is the unconstitutional power of government secrecy. Secrecy in the U.S. government, specifically the CIA, the NSA, and the FBI, has been weaponized. It is now being used as a weapon to conceal illegal activity, to hide what these agencies are doing in relation to constitutional violations, to entrap people, to silence whistleblowers by destroying their entire lives. So something has to be done about this. And I think the first thing to do is to educate people about what is going on. Then we'll start a grassroots movement, which has already begun. We've got over 1 million people out there, I think, that are now aware of this and climbing. And that's the idea. Then we can start pestering our congressmen and senators, which is not always successful because some of them are part of the corrupt system. Still, start pestering our congressmen and citizens and senators rather, and excuse me, bit of allergies today, and educate our friends, neighbors, and family. This is serious. We are on the verge of losing our constitutional form of government. Really, with what happened after the Patriot Act, we're in a post-constitutional government already, but it's getting even worse. We're seeing essentially a shadow government, deep state, soft coup against the sitting president. No matter what you think of Donald Trump, I'm an independent, I'm not a Democrat, I'm not a conservative. No matter what you think of Donald Trump, there is a deep state shadow government coup to try to remove him from office. A duly elected president, whether you agree with him or not, they are trying to literally engage in a coup and remove him from office. That is serious. It's never happened before in the history of the United States, ever. And it's going to get very ugly. It's going to get bad before it gets better. This could go on for several years. So we want to dig into that. And I want to talk about the shadow government and begin in this segment explaining basically what the shadow government is. I want to start with something, as I always do, excuse me, that's very important. And that is, it's almost gotten to the point now where people think that the U.S. Constitution is just a document of ideology or philosophy that doesn't really apply anymore. It was written by bigoted European men, and because of that, it should be redone. It's just kind of an ethical view of how things should be, but not really a legal document. That is all patently false. The United States Constitution is the supreme law of this land, of the United States. It trumps the entire criminal justice system, which fits underneath the U.S. Constitution. So if a government agency or a government official violates the Constitution, they have committed a felony or multiple felonies. We have to remember that. Now, you can take that and compare that with what's going on in Washington, D.C. right now with the FBI, also with the CIA, and of course, they use the NSA to spy on over 300 Americans. We're seeing the Constitution circumvented already, and some of these people, which I'll talk about in a later segment, have committed felonies, and we hope that they'll be held accountable. If they're not held accountable, then our constitutional form of government is over, and that's very serious. It is critical that these people are indicted and charged. If they're not, then our constitutional government has become a farce, which means we are losing our freedoms, one freedom at a time. And it's very serious. So let's move into this. I personally, having come from the belly of the beast, know that the shadow government, the secret government, and the deep state are really two different entities. The shadow government is the massive system of secrecy in the intelligence agencies and beyond, and the deep state is the system behind government. Excuse me again. Motivated by money, greed, supplying guns, missiles, and bullets, and making a living off of essentially war. So we'll talk about that. Also, the shadow government's power is in its extreme use of secrecy and the unbridled power of secrecy. The CIA, for example, I witnessed this personally, can shut down a case against it and black out all the unclassified evidence simply by invoking the state secrets privilege, which is rubber stamped by coerced federal judges. So the shadow government, the secret government, functions through the power and the abuse of secrecy. And of course, it is funded by millions of dollars of taxpayer money in secret budgets that not even Congress has access to. The Gang of Eight has access to them, the 8 congressmen and senators on the Gang of Eight that receive these top secret briefings on these things, and we'll talk about them later. But for right now, the shadow government, the CIA and the NSA, and the FBI now are concealing, covering up evidence using the unconstitutional power of secrecy. The deep state is run more by money and greed and power. The average CEO of a military industrial complex contractor makes about $27.1 million a year. The average program manager's salary is from $100,000 to $160,000 a year to run classified government programs. And all of these deep state corporations, which we will get into in detail, are forced to sign a secrecy oath, whether it's by the CIA, the NSA, or the FBI. Once they do that, from secretaries to CEOs, even the people that use the copiers are now bound by the secrecy oath. And if they violate that or say anything about the program, even if they disagree with it, they are subject to criminal penalties and possible prison sentence. So let's talk about this as this will be the end of our segment today as we introduce this. I want to talk about the shadow government itself and show you the massive complexity of this thing and the expansive power that the shadow government wields over the Congress, the executive branch, and the judiciary. And I will prove that later in this series. So the unconstitutional power of government secrecy, this is the shadow government. You got the Department of Homeland Security and its secret programs, the National Counterterrorism Center, its secret programs. And if you'll notice, every single one of these entities is tied in with government secrecy, and almost all of them are connected in some way or fashion to the CIA and the Director of National Intelligence. You got the Department of Defense. The DoD has classified secret contracts with the CIA and the NSA, as well as special operations programs of its own that are ruled by the power of secrecy. And anyone within the Department of Defense, military, et cetera, that speaks out against that, again, is subject to first censure, career destruction, and eventually the silencing of their case. The National Reconnaissance Office is responsible for all the satellites, the spy satellites up there, and I'm not going to go into that in detail for obvious reasons, but that is a massive secret system. The surveillance that goes on from space now, just not by the U.S., but from other countries like China, who former President Bill Clinton gave the technology to do this. Like China, they have surveillance satellites up in space that are surveilling people all the way down on the ground to a very minute level. Next, we've got the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. They do all of the mapping. For example, if they're going to send a Tomahawk missile in, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency will determine all the coordinates for that missile. You remember how things can go wrong when the NGA mistakenly targeted the Chinese embassy in Serbia and sent a missile in there, destroyed the Chinese embassy, and killed all of the diplomats inside. They got the coordinates wrong. A very, very serious international incident, which of course was brushed under the rug. And you got the Joint Special Operations Command. That is the president's secret army. Few know about. The president can dispatch JSOC anywhere in the world to carry out a termination program. That is not always bad. Sometimes the JSOC, and these JSOC men and women are highly trained. And frankly, they could have my back at any time. They're good soldiers. They do what they're ordered. They're the most heavily trained, similar to SEAL Team 6 in our entire government. So JSOC is essentially a secret army that functions outside of the usual DoD rules at the behest of the president. And it is a very, very secretive, excuse me, it is a very, very secretive program. Next, now I'm putting some ones up that are in white. The ones I'm placing in white are the ones that have grossly abused the power of secrecy. We're going to talk about each one in detail. The ones in white are the ones recently that unmasked the names of over 300 members of the Trump campaign, spied on all of us to the tune of 1.5 million pieces of information a day from our computers, our cell phones, our internet connections, the whole shebang. And of course, I've been subject to that pretty directly, as any threat to their power is. But we continue to stand. They're the ones who have broken the law, and we, the American people, need to expose that. So the NSA was involved in spying on members of the Trump campaign, over 300, as I mentioned, and all of us, the American people, in a gross abuse of the violation of the Fourth Amendment. Silicon Valley is directly connected, joined at the hip with the NSA. Google was started with CIA NSA algorithms, although they'll try to deny it. They were. That's where the programs came from, was from the CIA and the NSA, including some startup money from the NSA. So the NSA is tied in and actually depends on, many times, Silicon Valley operatives like Google, like Facebook, and like some of the other social media, but primarily Google is essentially an arm of the NSA. Too bad, because it's a great search engine. The Fisa Court is what, in this case, the FBI has to go before to obtain a warrant to conduct NSA surveillance on American citizens. The Fisa Court has been misused by the FBI recently, where they filed false affidavits full of false information based on this false dossier, which we'll talk about later on. The judges didn't know they were being lied to, and they issued FISA warrants for NSA surveillance on members of the Trump campaign. The FISA Court is essentially a secret Supreme Court. Brand new thing, not in the Constitution, created outside the Constitution, a secret Supreme Court that decides who and who will not be spied upon. The CIA. We know that the CIA was the central instigator of the false dossier coup against President Trump, aka or by its director, John Brennan, who I think is in serious legal trouble. But the CIA has grossly abused its power. And I do several lectures on the blood, on the CIA's roots from past to present. For example, the CIA supported and trained the Free Syrian Army, an Islamic army, claiming they were moderates. The Free Syrian Army's goal is an Islamic caliphate overtaking Western civilization. But apparently that didn't matter to the CIA, who armed and trained the Free Syrian Army. Some of those weapons, missiles, and tanks have wound up in the hands of Al-Qaeda and in the hands of ISIS. The Free Syrian Army went up and massacred an entire city of Christians. People don't know this because the news won't report it, obviously. That's no surprise there. The Free Syrian Army went up and massacred an entire Christian city. Assad was protecting the Christians in Syria. He was one of the only Middle Eastern leaders to do that. And as a matter of fact, Assad, with private funding and the sponsorship of Vladimir Putin, erected a 100-foot tall statue of Jesus in these Christian sectors to show their support from them. The CIA-backed Free Syrian Army went up and massacred the entire village. That is the CIA today, and it's got blood on its roots from the past. And when there's blood on the roots, the fruit is usually still blood. The Director of National Intelligence oversees allegedly all 17 of the intelligence agencies, including the CIA, although I can tell you that the CIA pretty much is still running the show, despite the creation of the Director of National Intelligence to try to stop, allegedly, supposedly, its abuses. The FBI functions, abuses secrecy. We see that now. The FBI filed false sworn affidavits, submitted them to the Fisa Court, and the Fisa Court approved the NSA surveillance of American citizens. Subsequently, the FBI blacked out all of the information about those affidavits, text messages, what the FBI was doing, the fact that they used this dossier for those files. The FBI blacked all of that out in the documents that they submitted to Congress. The President of the United States has now demanded that the FBI completely declassify those documents. The FBI has been refusing the order of their president, their boss, for several months now, refusing to release those documents to Congress and to the president. That is a potential constitutional crisis. They're refusing to this day. The Director of National Intelligence is now saying he doesn't want necessarily to release those, and if he does, they're going to be heavy redactions. Here we go again. Heavy redactions. I know for a fact that most of the blackouts and redactions in these FBI documents deal with nothing classified. Let me say that again, nothing classified. But it does reveal illegal activity on the part of the FBI. I saw this with the CIA myself when I wrote my book, From the Company of Shadows. The CIA blacked out all unclassified information, doctors' diagnoses, environmental tests of the poisoning of my family. So I've seen this personally. These are the agencies that have been involved in this. You have the Five Eyes, the other intelligence services that work directly with the CIA, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and others. They share intelligence back and forth. And as a matter of fact, the UK GCHQ can engage in surveillance that the CIA allegedly cannot do. So GCHQ could spy on an American, the Trump campaign, whoever, and then give that information to the CIA, and that would not be considered illegal going around the system. British MI6, we have an MI6 agent who gave the false information in the dossier from Russian intelligence and started through John Brennan and John McCain the entire coup, soft coup, against a presidential candidate and a sitting president. The Department of State was involved in this. We know now MI6 agent Christopher Steele met with the Department of State several times in secret meetings about the soft coup against the president. I can tell you from my past experience as a federal investigator that the Department of State is rife with espionage cases. It is also rife with democratic socialists, probably the majority, who want to see the overturning of a free market-based constitutional government. And they're all through the Department of State. The Department of State does not have polygraph tests. So people there can lie about anything, and their background checks are pretty shallow, and they're not going to find something that's concealed. So it's a mess. All of this goes back on the Council on Foreign Relations. People say, oh, you talk about the Council on Foreign Relations, that's just a conspiracy theory. Well, I'll deal with legal conspiracy theory definition later on, and I have an entire lecture on the Council on Foreign Relations. The Council on Foreign Relations created the CIA. Allen Dulles, the first CIA director, official first CIA director, was an acting member of the Council on Foreign Relations, as was the owners of the Washington Post, Philip and Catherine Graham. The CFR today is heavily connected to CNN, NBC, and other major news medias, and sits on the board of the Council on Foreign Relations with the CIA. So we'll talk more about that later on. Here we go. Now, the sad part of all of this, you all, is the fact that the mainstream media is complicit in all of this. When is the last time that you saw a mainstream investigative journalist do an actual investigation on the CIA? Almost none. There's a reason for that. Excuse me, which I will talk about in detail, why the mainstream media twists the news, eliminates the news, and actually puts out false propaganda. Why it does that? It has connections to the CIA. It has connections to Disney, 6 corporations now on most of the media, and there's even more than that. George Soros is funding much of the media opposition to conservatives and the Trump administration. I am not a Republican. There are some good Republicans. I think Rand Paul has always been, as his father was a constitutionalist, and I support him. There's a lot of rhinos, Republicans in name only, that are as corrupt as the Democrats and are part of the system without a doubt. And now you can see why the GOP never has me come and speak. I consider that a compliment. So the mainstream media is covering this stuff up. It will not investigate these white shadow government agencies specifically, and it will not take the case of any whistleblower within the shadow government. For example, I blew the whistle on the abuse of the state's secret privilege, and I faced prison for 5 years for doing it. They poisoned my family, and they sealed all the evidence, environmental tests, using the state's secret privilege, and then blacked out all the doctor's diagnosis and environmental test results in my book, which according to an executive order by Ronald Reagan is illegal for them to do that. So they violated the law there. Then after I refused, they settled with our family because the evidence I presented was so strong. The judge ordered them to a mediated settlement. They signed the settlement documents. 3 days later, they called my attorney and ordered him to tell me that if I did not accept a fraction of that settlement, they were going to invoke the state's secrets privilege and seal all the evidence that I had compiled in our case. Of course, I told my attorney to tell them not only no, but H double toothpicks no. You signed a settlement agreement, and I expect you to abide by that. About a week later, the CIA invoked the state secrets privilege, sealed all the evidence of poisoning, the doctor's diagnosis and environmental tests, sealed it, and then told us that if we talked about that evidence to anyone, we would go to prison. You can imagine the level of outrage that we had when that happened. And then they blocked all of Congress and the Senate from accessing any information in our case. A very good man, Congressman Frank Wolf, took our case, contacted the CIA 7 times, demanding an investigation. The CIA blew him off the first 5 calls. The very last call, they said he had no access to that. It was a judicial matter and was none of his business. So they have managed to seal the evidence from Congress. That's how serious this is. I talk about the state secrets privilege, which has been used to destroy thousands of lives. I talk about that, and we'll talk about that later in these programs. So you can see the sheer size of the shadow government. Right now, we still have what's called COG, or the continuity of government, which the shadow government at any time can usurp the United States Constitution and take over control of our government. Since 9/11, continuity of government has been established. Continuity of government is still there, which means that the federal government can supersede the Constitution at any time because of the declared war on terror, and that was on purpose. Because of the declared war on terror, we're still under the continuity of government, and the Constitution could be suspended at any time. So our next program, I'm going to get into the deep state, talk about what the deep state is, the military-industrial complex, more properly, the military-industrial congressional complex, because it involves extortion and bribery of congressmen and senators. That's what we're looking at for our next programs, everyone. And we're just getting all of our things set up here and ready to start these broadcasts again. I hope you all will join us. There's going to be probably, I would say, 50 of these coming up. And I think they're going to be pretty shocking, pretty eye-opening. And I'm hoping, and the reason I'm making these is you can share these small segments with people that you know so that they can get educated on what is actually going on and what essentially now is a post-constitutional government. So thank you all for being here. And we will see you the next recording, which should come next week. And then we will continue on. Thanks, you all.